Hi everyone, and welcome back to the final video in my series on my summer project on the Veil Nebula complex, also known as the Cygnus Loop. So in the last episodes of this, we've gone through how to plan, which panels you're going to put together for a mosaic, get your framing right, went through making test shots to make sure everything's going to line up, and doing some initial kind of test stitching together of that mosaic. And then finally we went through and actually created the mosaic with the final combined and stacked images that I had. So now in this episode, I'm going to run through what I did along the way to go from those panels, those combined mosaics, to the final image. I'm not going to go through each step of the process for a couple of reasons. One, some of this it just takes too long. There's so much on it. You know, when you look at things like deconvolution and things like that, that it just is. It's going to take too much time to go through. So the other part is that honestly, I saved a lot along the way, but I don't have an exact history to compare to on all of this. So what we're going to do is go through each of my kind of milestone images along the way, and I'm going to talk briefly about what I did to go from step one to step two on that, without the specific kind of settings details. There are plenty of in-depth tutorials on things like noise reduction or deconvolution that are going to do it much more justice than I would trying to quickly shoehorn it in here. So to start off with, we ended up with two finished mosaic panels, or two mosaics for each band. So we had our hydrogen alpha here, and I had my O3 here. So I had to go through, and I'm just clicking on this so you can kind of see some of the blending of the two together, where hydrogen alpha really comes in some of these areas to go where the O3 doesn't. And had to go through and kind of match the intensities on these actual finished mosaics, just like I did in the previous video on some of the individual panels, so that we'd be real close. And then after that, there was some noise reduction done here. Now, these are kind of the start-offs. So, and even on the scrolling, it takes some time. These are very big files at this point, because I did do the drizzle integration, which means that my 1:1 pixel scales at this level, so very, very detailed before you start running into things like super pixelated stars. But you can tell there's a lot of noise in this image, and instead of trying to process it all at once, in terms of the stars and the nebula all together, one of the things that happens when you start stretching these out is your stars get bloated. You start losing a lot of the things that make things look pinpoint in order to really bring out the brightness and the nebulosity. So one of the things that I did along the way here is use a star removal process, which in and of itself makes some gorgeous images. This is the hydrogen alpha, and this is the O3. There's some methods for doing something very similar using just PixInsight tools, but one of the tools that I was exposed to from one of the other members of my group was a program called StarNet++. I'll put a link in the description to actually going and finding that program and how to use it. It's very, very much bare bones in terms of how you execute the program, but it does have both a standalone program as well as a process that can be installed into PixInsight. And in general, as you can tell, the options super limited. This concept of a stride, which is kind of how many pieces of the image it's looking at a time, and whether or not you want it to create a star mask. The thing I will tell you is that this process takes a ridiculously long amount of time to run if you have a very large image. In my case, because I'm running at such a high resolution on this panel, these images were I believe, a little over a gigabyte in size for each one. And that just makes it, actually, I think it was a little under a gigabyte before I combined the colors, which just means it takes a couple of hours for this process to run on one of these panels. But as you can see, the result is very, very clean in terms of the stars pretty much just being gone. You know, there's a couple of areas where you'll still have the halo from around a star. You may even have a few artifacts in there, but I'm not worrying about that too much. The point here is to be able to take the stars out of the image so that I can do things like playing around with the colors in here. Or doing some incredibly heavy noise reduction without worrying about my stars getting chewed up because the stars aren't here. I'll combine them back in later. And I'll come back to this create star mask option here in a little bit, as it has some value later in the process. But once I had these two starless images, it was easy to then go ahead and try to balance the background intensities. You can tell this one's significantly darker than this one was, and align them up to come up with what's called a tone map. And this is the color combine on those images. So in and of itself, this is not bad looking, and I've seen a lot of people post starless nebula images in their own right. But the point here is to get the color balance right. And I'm not very concerned with the level of detail and sharpness in this image, because once again, this is all for color, for proper color kind of balance and intensity and that kind of thing. So a lot of the noise reduction that gets done in here can be pretty aggressive as it goes through, because at the end of the day, this isn't what's going to provide the final detail. So while I have this tone map and work on that, separately, I have a luminance image. Now, in many cases for nebulas, you might work with just the original hydrogen alpha panel as your luminance image. That in a lot of nebulas is really where all of the detail lies. But as we saw when we had the O3 on top, there are a lot of areas where the O3 is actually providing most of the structure detail, and the hydrogen alpha is just kind of informing out to the sides. So they're kind of, combining pretty equally to different parts of the nebula detail. So in that case, what I decided to do on this one was combine the two of them together using pixel math. So in pixel math, literally I can say I want to take the HA full mosaic, and I want to add it with the O3 full mosaic, and then I'll say times 0.5, because at the end of the day I'm trying to come up with a single number in each pixel that equals, let's say it was 100%. Where do I want that 100% to come from? I'm going to want it to come from 50% the HA full mosaic and 50% the O3 full mosaic. And I'm not actually going to run this now because the images, like I said, are pretty big, but it just pops out a nice combination of those. And you can play around with, do I want it to be 60-40, 70-30, even 90-10 to kind of get to that level. And that was what I did to come up with a luminance, a detail layer that was comprised of both the HA and O3. And then I went to work on that. And that's really where a lot of the work would come in on sharpening up these details. This one I don't think has all of that in it. I think this is before I did a lot of that work. But that's where deconvolution and things like that come into play, and you're really sharpening as well as doing things like balancing the lightness, doing processes like the local histogram equalization, the median scale transforms, all that kind of stuff that is covered in just general narrowband processing tutorials that I encourage you to take a look at on YouTube here. And I'll probably do one of those at some point, but for this process, this one's kind of extra big, so I'm just going through some of the other steps there. So once I had a completed tone map and a completed luminance, you can just combine the two together using the LRGB combination function. And that's what I did to start off here. And overall, this looks pretty good as a start. The colors look really nice and super vibrant, right? And my stars haven't bloated out, of all reason. But one of the things that happens when you look in here, this can all look pretty good, but if you notice, all my stars are white. And this is really the result of that StarNet process, because it removed all the stars from my actual tone map. So I don't have any color data for these stars. So that, in some cases, if you're dealing with something like the North American Nebula, where your entire image is nothing but nebula, that may not matter. You may want nice, small, pretty much white stars, may be fine. But in this case, I really wanted to add some more realistic color to the rest of the stars in the image. And I'm not going to get realistic color from narrowband at all in general. So I went and took a few more frames of just color data, through my telescope. So I did that over the course of a night and ended up with this here. So you can tell, you can barely see the wispy kind of nebulosity in here. This was not, anywhere near the amount of time that I spent in on the narrowband data. But you can also see why it can be so difficult to get good results on just RGB color data from your backyard in a light polluted sky. But what you can get is, even though I don't have this nebulosity, so you can tell I've got star color all over the place, right? The stars keep shining even under the light pollution. So that's what I was going for. And once I registered those images to my mosaic, I think I took these at a wider field of view and just took two panels because I didn't need as much data, and did some really strong noise reduction here because, once again, I'm just trying to get the color data for these stars. I don't care about any detail in these nebulas at all. As a matter of fact, the nebulas are kind of in my way a little bit. They may be pretty dim, but I've already done all my nebula work somewhere else. So that's where I was able to use this StarNet process again, and this time click the Create Star Mask option. So what that does is kind of invert the process. So what's going through and trying to use its neural networking algorithm to figure out what a star is and remove the star, it can reverse that process and say, give me only the stars. And that is the result here. So now I have that same image, but without essentially all the nebulosity and, honestly, all of the background. All of that just gray that I had smoothed out to nothing went away, and now I'm left with just a nice, field of the stars, and specifically the colors in there. So at that point, you can kind of stretch this out, get the brightness up on the individual stars as you want, and combine that with the tone map. So it's really, I just did that in Photoshop, just overlaying the two together, because remember, my tone map is everything but stars, and then I have an image of just stars. So quickly overlaying those together gave me this resulting image where I'm getting my star color. I'm no longer at just pure white stars, right? Now, granted, once again, this still is just color data. So while I may see some detail in here, it isn't, fully sharpened up and everything that I was doing on that luminance layer. So using LRGB combination at that point, I can take that luminance master file that I was working on to really get the detail just right, and combine that with this color data to get a final one. And I've already done that here, and I'm just going to hit the step forward button so the difference can kind of come through. And there we go. So I'm going to jump back and forth a little bit. Unfortunately, the files are so big, it takes a couple of seconds to go back and forth. But you can kind of see that a lot of things that I had kind of overly brightened start to tone down a little bit, right? And that's really from trying to make the most out of the luminance layer to get the right amount of detail without starting to fade all this to white. And this is all super personal preference. You might like the color balance and the brightness of the colors in this one versus the other one. For me, I really wanted a deeper, little bit darker blue in mine. And so once I moved up in there, you can see the full kind of final combination, right? Where I have a lot of detail out here in the nebula, but I still have really good star color and that kind of thing as a natural blend at the end of the process there. So that gets me one set of fully combined and colorized data with natural star color. And after that, it was really just a little bit of tweaking to taste, a little bit of curves adjustment, a little bit of saturation adjustment, that kind of thing, to get to my final image. And so this was my final that I kind of put through as my end result. But you'll see I've got a bunch of images after that, right? And why is that? So the first thing is, this file is huge, and I mean huge. This is, almost, I think it's 1.5 gigs in size. So this isn't something I can just share on Flickr or Astrobin or even Facebook, right? It's just way too big. But I wanted it to be that big because of one of the things I'm going to show you here in a second. But so I've got this large file and I need to start scaling it down. And that's really where in the last video I showed the integer resample, where you can do scale factors to start reducing things down. And that's what I did, is I did a factor of 2 and then another factor of 2. Let me see which one I'm looking at. Yeah, so this is the quarter size here. And at first blush, out of this scale, really can't see a difference, right? And you kind of wonder, well, why did you work on one at one level and one at another? Well, let me go into the 1-to-1 ratio here. So when we're at the 1-to-1 there versus the 1-to-1 here, you can see that the 1-to-1 on the final is zoomed in way more than the quarter. So let's try to get a similar zoom on the quarter and see where we end up. There we go. This one and this one and this one and this one. You can see how much more pixelated and rough that detail is, right? And that may not seem like much when you're out in the boonies part of the image, but when we get into the detail here, you can see how it's all jagged around that edge versus up on this one at a similar zoom in, it's just very, very, very smooth all along that same edge, right? So it's kind of, what's your purpose? If I'm going to publish this this photo out on Facebook or something like that, I'm definitely going to use the quarter option. It takes this whole thing from being somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5 gigs down to about 80 megabytes. Right, and that can very easily be converted into a PNG or a JPEG, depending on how much quality loss you're interested in, to be something that can be pretty web friendly. The other thing that I did was, and let me close up the tone map one here. I also had a darker version. So when I look at these, and I'm going to shrink these down just a little bit so I can have them more side by side. Has to think about it. You can see how this one has a little bit lighter background than this one does, but at the same point in time, some of the super faint nebulosity here isn't coming out as much as it is over here. And I saved both of these. Personally, I like the darker one a little bit better. This is really my preferred kind of version. I like the little bit darker sky. I think it looks better on my monitor. But I've also been burned in the past depending on where I want to put these images up. Especially when printing, I've noticed that a darker background, a lot of this stuff starts to get lost. So I kept the smaller, the lighter version specifically for printing purposes. And I really wanted to make sure that that I had one that was a little bit more pre-lightened at the full resolution, because I can always shrink it down after the fact. So if I want to print this up in a larger format, it'll already be kind of pre-brightened. I won't have lost any data or shrunk any of that data down in a save. So I encourage you, you may want to save one that's just a little brighter than the other one before you start shrinking everything down and losing data. But so now that I've got that, the other thing on why I didn't shrink it all down to begin with is that I knew that there were several different interesting pieces of this nebula that I was going to want to grab at full resolution to be images in their own right. So the two that I'll show you real quick here are really the Witch's Broom area and the Eastern Veil here. And, having it at the full resolution really allows you to bring a lot out. So with the Witch's Broom, I was able to do, kind of a rotated crop that's really focusing in on this area, right? And this could have been the target I went after from the very beginning, right? And I feel like this in and of itself for my current skill set is just about as good as I could do this target. I just also happen to have the whole rest of that complex in there and can kind of take it at any level I want. So I was able to crop this out into its own separate one. And then with the Eastern Veil, I also was able to do kind of a crop and rotate in. And this one, I haven't looked at, as we went through this as much, but boy, there's so much detail in this image, right? Looking at the sides here where they're really coming together, becoming white out of those color balances, but then over into the areas of really the kind of spiky edges of the veil and the blue ridging, on the top there, so much detail in this area. And if I had run this at the process the whole thing at say half or quarter resolution, I might have lost, a ton of this. Right now I'm still not even considered 1-to-1 on this image. That's down at this level, right? Before I'd start pixelating and things like that. So just so much that I could have in there. And this is just a very small part, right, of this image here, right? So that was my thought process on going through it. It also slowed it way down. It took me about a week of working through the evenings to kind of get to that finished view that I was really happy with, especially once I decided I really needed to go and get the RGB star color to really make this come out the way I wanted it to. But it was a labor of love. And in your mosaics, that may not be as much as you want to do. If you're doing a mosaic of, say, the North American Nebula, there may not be that many pieces that are super fine detail. It may be more just trying to get that outer field of view is what you're really going for, in which case, definitely downscale it and work with it at the faster rates. You can always upscale back, but it's never going to be as smooth as what you had originally there when you're upscaling back. So that's it. That's taking it all the way from the planning process to the final image on my summer project for the Veil Nebula complex. I hope this has been fun for you guys to see. Maybe a little bit of schadenfreude at my anguish going through a few of the pieces here. Believe me, I cut a lot out of these videos of me screwing it up. So expect that when you come in here, you're going to be doing a lot of trial and error. These big multi-panel mosaics are not a zippy process, even using some other tools out there. They really are for when you really want to make something special. And that's, for me, what I did here. I feel like I accomplished what I set out to do. But for the rest of the summer, I think I'm going to go back to single shots that I'm combining for a while here. And I think actually my next video on processing may be going over how fast I can get to a pretty good result starting from the raw images there. So that's it for this time. I hope you enjoyed this. Feel free to leave me any comments on questions or things you have, or areas that I might have just totally glossed over that you'd like me to do a deeper video on later. Until next time, I wish everybody clear skies. Thanks.